All right, guys, we're going to go over the steps on how this map was created within Illustrator using the extension ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Illustrator. We're going to go over how I downloaded the spatial data from ArcGIS Online through the plugin and cleaned up the files and then brought all this information into After Effects to animate the map. What we're seeing here is the vector map. The nice thing about this plugin is that it allows you to bring in all this vector data that you could go in and edit. As a designer, it's huge because now I have access to all this information and I could change colors, change thickness, and really gear this to help me tell my story. Now, as far as the motion part, we will be going over this example here where I import different spatial data for the ferry routes in New York City, population data across the city, bringing those elements into Illustrator and then kicking it out to After Effects. So let's jump back into Illustrator and I'll show you how this map was created. So to launch the extension, it is in Windows and Extensions, and you're running ArcGIS Maps from Adobe Creative Cloud. The extension is set up on two different windows, your compilation plane and your map board. Your map board is where you're going to be setting your extent. In this example, I manually selected the area around New York City and Jersey City. Once the extent is selected, you want to move over into the compilation window. The compilation window gives you a preview of what your map will look like. And it's at this point where you can start bringing in the different data. So let's turn these off so you can see what we're talking about. You could select different base maps, some being bitmap. So again, this will not be a vector solution for you. So this would be great. This is what you're looking for, but you can't edit any of this unless you're in Photoshop per se. But the vector street data maps are completely editable, and each of these elements are brought in their own layer, which is really cool. So now let's jump into how I would bring in population data. This is an example of the data we're going to bring in, but we'll just do it again for the sake of the tutorial. So we go into Add Content, Add Layer. I would go under Maps for Adobe for Creative Cloud. Now this is curated information just for the extension, which is pretty cool. So you want to add the data. If you wanted to know more information about the data as to the rights behind it, you would open it up under full description. It'll send you to a link, going back to Illustrator. And to add it, you would just select the plus feature. Now I have these ferry routes that I had already brought in, but I will delete these as well, and I'll bring them back in. Okay, let's add layer. Now this time we are going to select ArcGIS Online, and we're going to type in NYC _ ferry, do our search, and we see we have ferry route from 2018. Now if we wanted more information on this data set, we would click on full description and it'll take you to a website that'll give you the rights and information on the data. So we will add this and close this. And now we have the routes. No, these are the stops. These would be the routes. Yeah, these are the stops in a separate layer. And we have the population data. And underneath that, we have our base map. So we're going to have some editing to do in Illustrator once we get all this information in. But for now, if we wanted to see all that in Illustrator, we hit sync. So now what it's doing, it's generating all this data, and we'll kick out a layered Illustrator file from the plugin, and we could clean this up so we could bring this into After Effects to animate. So this is going to take a little time to process.
Once the sync is complete, the spatial data and vector base map are available in a native Illustrator file. From here, we can adjust any colors, sizes, layer orders, anything that we see fit in order to best tell our story. You will notice that you have more information than you need. So some prep is required prior to importing into After Effects. So we want to eliminate any elements that could distract or take away from the areas we want to highlight. So let's start with the base map and let's jump into that. So we have here, let's turn off the population data stuff. Here we go. Cool. Now let's get into the labels. I think the labels are a little bit too much. The nice thing about this is you can see how everything just drops in from that layer set. It's named, it's labeled, which made things easier. So let's turn off all the labels. Yeah, that's good. I don't think we need those. That takes away from it. So we won't delete them. We'll just turn them off in case we want to bring it back later. These little circle things, they're populated places. I don't think we need it. I think it's just more distracting. Now this is just a choice. Personally, I think these orange lines, which are the freeways, they're too thick for my taste. So what I'll do is I'll select them, and I think I'm going to drop this thickness of the stroke maybe down to 1.5. So let's do that now. Let's select that. I think that's a little better. Yeah, I like that better. It's not as overpowering. Maybe 1. I want them there, but I don't want them too thick so that they're as pronounced as they're coming up. So that works. That works. And what else? I think that should do it for the base map as far as the prep for that. So with that, we will close the base map up and let's move on to the population data and the ferry routes, which is the spatial data we imported from Adobe Maps CC. So let's start with the ferry stations per se. So here we have, okay, these are the stations. And these would be the routes. Okay, let's label this as stations. Okay, I think I did that previously, but we want to label everything so it comes in clearly in After Effects and we can move things around. So let's select these 2 layers and we'll move them to the top of our layer order. Perfect. And we're doing this so we could isolate and animate each one of these layers once we get into After Effects. And on the station stops, it's too similar to our population data colors, which I'm happy with, but let's make these possibly a blue. See how something around this hue, and I'll copy the index color. Now I think I'll make it white. I'll make this a white. Okay, and the stroke possibly, let's give it a 1-point stroke. See, I think that stands out a little bit more. So let's scale these down. This is the nice thing about these elements coming in as they do from the plugin, because now it's easy to go in and just make these incremental tweaks. I'm happy with that. I think that works. So these are the stations, got it, and these are my routes. Perfect. Okay. Next, we are gonna break apart the population data so that each layer is easily animated once we get into After Effects. So I will select the top, the 0 to 1,000 people per square mile, hold down Shift, and select the last layer within that grouped set, and I will move this up to about here. Okay, perfect. The 4,000 by 22,000 per square mile layer. I want to bring each one of these boxes or these shapes, and I want to fade them on or pop them on in After Effects individually. So in order to do that, I would have to break out each one of these from these group and make them its own individual layer. So in order to do so, I will select the layer, and on this top within Illustrator, we're gonna go release. We're gonna select release layers to sequence. And what that does is that it breaks these elements out of that layer. And if I hold down that top layer again, hold down Shift and scroll down to the very last layer and select, now I have each one of those elements selected. And I could take the entire group and just move it up in the layer order. So now, with that said, each one of these pieces is now an individual element that I could access within After Effects. And that's what we want to do. And we're only doing that to this layer. The other ones we will animate with an animated mask, and we'll get into that later in the tutorial. My last thing is I think these routes within the base map look really interesting. So what I'm going to do now is take these ferry routes, them out of the base map layer and up in the layer order. This might take a little scrolling up. So right now what I'm doing, I just selected and I'm moving up within the layer order. And I think it'll make sense to drop this here. Okay, perfect. So I have my ferry route, the routes from the other layer sets, and these are the stations. So these are the ferry routes coming from the base map. Okay, perfect. And that should do it for the prep. If we save this out and import into After Effects, each one of the elements that we've determined that are going to be animated are now easily selected and ready to be animated. Now let's import our prepped Illustrator file into After Effects. Go into our file, let's import, and let's find our Illustrator project. Okay, now select your prep map. Now under the Import As tab, we want to import as a composition and retaining the layer size. So this will just bring in all those layers that we've prepped in Illustrator into After Effects. Let's hit OK. Let that load. With our Illustrator file now imported into After Effects, let's go ahead and double click the comp to open it. And our first step is I'll bring in the reference video that we will be replicating, animating each one of these orange parcels to appear on and stay on. So in a sense that they're fading on and staying on. And if we go back to After Effects, that was the 4000 by 22,000 layer set that we broke up into individual layers. So I will select Start by clicking on it, and I will go down to, let's say, 450 maybe, and hold down the Shift key and select. Now that'll select all those layers. And if I right click over this layer group color, I will set these to blue. So the layer group just makes it handy to select all those layers. And if we click on the stopwatch, we want to advance 5 frames. So let's type in 5. That'll put us at exactly 5 frames within the timeline. Now we want to trim all these layers by selecting Option and the close brackets. That'll trim all the selected layers down to 5 frames. If we right click, we want to check we want to scroll down to Keyframe Assistance, Sequence Layer, set that to 5 frames, and we want to dissolve the front layer. Then we hit OK. And that should, in a sense, sequence all those layers automatically. But the problem we're having now is that they're coming on and then fading back on. And what I want to do now, if I hit T on the keyboard, that'll bring up all our opacity keyframes. Now we want to select all these opacity keyframes by dragging a marquee around all our opacity keyframes. If we hold down the spacebar and hold down Shift again, we can continue to select all of these opacity keyframes. I maybe should have just selected. Okay, we're almost there. There we go. With all the opacity keyframes selected, if we right click on the keyframes, select keyframe assistance, and let's time reverse those keyframes. Once we time reverse the keyframes, we're going to hit end on the keyboard and option backspace to extend the length of all those layers. And if we hit the home key and animate on, now each parcel is animating on and staying on. So we know that we've selected up to layer 450. Now we're going to select from layer 451 down to the end layer, basically the last layer. So that's layer 247. So let's change this layer group color to yellow. Perfect. Now let's advance again. We're just going to repeat the step so it's easier to select all those opacity keyframes. 5 frames. Option close bracket to trim. And now if we scroll up to layer 451, we are going to right click, keyframe assistance, sequence layer. Again, the 5 frames, dissolve front layer, okay. And hitting T on your keyboard brings up those keyframes. Spacebar brings up the hand, and we move within our timeline and dragging across to select all the opacity keyframes, holding shift to select any additional frames. Spacebar again, moving up, shift, and drag around as many opacity keyframes as we can, and we'll just repeat the process. Oops, did I miss one? No, we got it. Hold down shift. I think I hit spacebar and it's playing the animation that I currently have. So let's right click to time reverse the keyframes. We hit end on our keyboard and option close backspace. Okay, perfect. If I hit home and RAM preview that, and to RAM preview it is option 0. The next population data layer will be revealed with the LumaMat, and that's the 22,000 by 16,000 here, which is this darker red layer. So we'll go over how to set up your LumaMat and how to use the black and white values to reveal this layer. So if you go into composition, new composition, and we will name this comp noise build on. Say OK. And we will create a solid layer, new solid. We'll set the color to black. That's fine. And we will name this layer checkered transition. Okay. We will apply 2 different effects, turbulent noise and mosaic. So let's start with turbulent noise, and that could be found under the noise and grain tab under effects. So if we click on effects, noise and grain, turbulent noise. Okay, now let's just go ahead and add the mosaic effect as well, and that's under effects style, I believe. Effects, is it stylize mosaic. Now let's apply the following keyframes to this effect. So we will set the fractal type to basic. under the turbulent noise, which is good. Okay, we have that set. The noise type is block. Noise type is block. Got it. And let's set the brightness to -30 at the beginning of this composition. So the brightness, which is here, let's set that to a -130, in a sense making it completely black. And let's move in time maybe 1 second and 22 frames. We will set it for 135. Now let's set the scale to 257 and scale within the effects. So is that under transform? Yes. Now let's set our mosaic at a horizontal block, which is here at 31, and our vertical, so let's say 18. That'll give us more of a checkered pattern, or almost a smaller squares. And if we go back to our comp, we want to add the noise filter right above the layer that we'd like to apply this on, which is, and now we want to set the track mat for the 22,000 by 116,000 layer to recognize the black and white values of this noise build on, and in a sense making the track mat active and using the light and dark values of that layer to reveal that information. So now select the track mat and select Luma Mat noise build on. And now what we should see, if we go back to home, option 0, preview, now we're using a track mat to bring in this the 22,000 by 116,000 layer set, which is more efficient and a faster way to animate, but a different look altogether. But I thought I'd just give an example of two different ways of bringing in these layer sets and animating them in After Effects. So now that that's done, our next step would be to animate our ferry route, or these multiple ferry routes as they make their way down to the different stops. Our next step is to convert the ferry routes into a vector layer within After Effects. So if we right click on the routes, hover over create, and create shapes from vector layers, we are in a sense converting this into a vector path within, or a vector outline within After Effects. So now we could change the color, we could change the shape of the path altogether, which is very helpful. So if we scroll down to content and we hit add, we will select trim path, scroll down the trim path, and now we have the options of start and an offset. If we set that, as you can see, it'll just basically trim that path down. If we set a keyframe to 100 and advance, let's advance 20 frames. To do so, we hit plus on our keyboard, type in 20, and it'll do the math for you. Now if I type in 0, reveals my entire path. So now we just decide where we want that path to start appearing. I think at this point the majority of the parcels are on. We could drag these out, maybe extend it a little longer, and there you have it. So now you have a vector base map spatial data brought in from ArcGIS Maps from Adobe Creative Cloud, cleaned up in Illustrator, and animated in After Effects. So now that all these elements are in After Effects, you could gear and add any effects you see necessary within After Effects to help better tell your story.